Choosing the right lure for the right situation can definitely help you get more bites, and there are a few different factors that I take into account when I'm choosing which lure I clip on. Some of the main points I'm going to try and cover today are the profiles of the different soft baits and hard baits that we'll be using, the colours as well, depending on the clarity of the water and the conditions, and also the different fall rates of different soft baits as they fall through the water. So hopefully you'll learn a little bit today, and fingers crossed we catch a few fish too. One of the most important things to bear in mind when choosing a lure is the colour, and that's normally dependent on one or two different things really. It can be down to the clarity of the water and also the weather conditions as well. So for example, today I'm fishing on a small river. It's quite shallow and the water's almost crystal clear now. It's also a very dull day. It's pretty grey and gloomy at the moment, and in these kind of conditions I would choose a dull coloured soft bait. I'm not really a big fan of fishing bright lures in clear water unless I'm fishing in very low light levels or at night. So I've gone for something quite dull at the moment. I'm using a critter in the natural colour, and I'm going to have a few casts in this pool. It looks pretty good in the slack areas over the back there. I'll also have a couple of casts down the edge, and then I'll move on downstream. Finally got some action. Hey. First fish of the day. This pool absolutely screams fish, and I managed to catch this pike on my second cast on a Salmo Hornet. I'm mainly talking about soft baits today, but the same principles with colour also applies with hard baits. So I've had a couple of casts here with the Hornet because it's the ideal kind of lure for covering a pool where it's quite shallow over the back and then it's kind of quite deep in the edge here. So as I retrieve, the crankbait's swimming down deeper and going along the shelf that runs along the back there. So what's happened is I've just retrieved it along there and it's nailed it. And in terms of colours, I've been using quite a dull colour. It's the brown trout colour, and the pike certainly liked it. So we're going to get him back now, have a few more casts, and hopefully we might catch a few more as well. I'm having a break from fishing for 5 minutes or so, and it gives me a little bit of time to go into depth a little bit more about the types of colours I choose for different types of water clarities, weather conditions and depths as well. So the river that we're fishing on today is quite small, it's crystal clear at the moment, and there are some deep areas, but most of it's pretty shallow. And for this kind of scenario, a lot of the time I'm choosing quite dull colours. The reason I choose dull colours over bright colours is because with the bright colours they're often a little bit too loud and flashy, whereas the dull colours will better mimic the prey that the fish are eating. So some of the main prey that the predators will eat in small rivers like this will be sticklebacks, minnows, gudgeon, invertebrates such as crayfish, and even nymphs that crawl along the bottom as well. Fish like perch and chub will eat. So you're often using very dull colours to imitate the food that the fish are eating in crystal clear venues. So I've picked out a few different examples. UV dark oils, one of my favourite colours in clear water, especially for perch and zander. Any of the supernatural colours in the range as well. and also your bait fishy colours, such as, actually I'll just pull this one out. I've got a pro shad here that perfectly mimics a small roach, one of the main prey fish that pike, perch and zander eat. So they're an example of some of the dull colours that I'd use in crystal clear water, not only on small rivers like this, but larger venues such as big rivers, canals, reservoirs and crystal clear gravel pits as well. Any of those colours that I've just mentioned there would be good shouts on venues like those. There are scenarios though where I would choose a brighter lure over a dull lure when fishing in crystal clear water, and the two times I'd choose a brighter lure would be if I'm fishing in very deep water. So if I'm fishing a dull lure in deep water, sometimes it might not show up enough, so if you're not getting any bites, then it can be worth changing to a brighter lure, and that can often get you a few more takes. But also when fishing at night as well. So I like to lure fish at night for chub and zander, and fishing a brighter colour such as pink like this, chartreuse, lemon tiger, white, bright colours that are going to stand out well in the low light, they can work really well for predatory species as well. So they're the two scenarios that I would use bright colours in crystal clear water. But a lot of the time I prefer to use brighter colours in coloured water. So for example, a week ago this river was in flood, and if I would have been fishing some of the slack areas of the river where it's not pushing through as much and the fish can rest and the bait fish will gather as well, then targeting those slack areas with a bright colour such as any of those I've just mentioned there would have been a good bet. Another great type of venue where brighter colours work really well at times is on canals. So if you have a canal near you that has a lot of boat traffic, there are lots of boats going up and down and they stir up the bottom, you'll notice if you look at the colour of the water that it'll often be chocolate or really coloured. So fishing a bright colour like pink or chartreuse, lemon tiger, that kind of thing will stand out a lot more than a duller colour such as the supernatural colours or UV dark oil or the bait fishy colours. So that is another situation where I would often prefer to use a bright colour over a dull colour. One other time that I might use a bright colour as well is that if I am fishing a crystal clear venue such as the one I'm fishing today, and the dull colours just aren't getting me any bites. So sometimes when you use a bright colour it can actually switch the fish on, and they almost take the lure out of aggression rather than actually taking it to feed. So if you're fishing a bright colour such as lemon tiger yellow, something like that in crystal clear water, and the fish see it, sometimes it aggravates them and they just take it purely out of aggression. So that can be another good time to use a bright colour as well. So generally I like to use dull lures when I'm fishing in crystal clear water and brighter colours when I'm fishing in coloured water, something that will stand out a little bit more. There's all different variables, and it's all down to really chopping and changing on the day and seeing what works for you. Now today's a pretty standard winter day really. It's pretty grey and miserable to be honest, but in the summer months and on days where it's brighter, when I'm fishing in clear water I'll obviously stick with the dull lures, but when you're fishing in coloured water you can get away with using lures that aren't quite as flashy and bright as some of the colours like pink and chartreuse that I've mentioned that I would normally use in dull water. So for example, I might change to a UV coloured lure such as the dark oil, the Arkansas, those kind of colours, because when you have more sunlight penetrating them it can make it stand out a little bit more in the coloured water and give the lures a little bit more of a silhouette even in coloured water. So when you're fishing on bright days, obviously stick with your dull colours in the clear water, but in your coloured water conditions try the bright colours. If things aren't happening, then just try dulling things down a little bit and trying something a little bit more natural, because sometimes that can get you a few more fish on the bank as well. We've just reached quite an open bit of water. Oh, the lure's come out, that's handy. We've just reached quite an open bit of water and I've seen a few bait fish in the margins. So I just switched to a slick shad and pretty much straight away I've hooked into this pike. I really thought it was a perch at first, you know, when you get the heavy head shakes, but it turned out to be this little fella. So I'll stick him back. If we're going to get a perch, it's going to be now because the light's fading. So come on, Mr. Stripey. As well as colour, another really important factor when it comes to lure choice is the profile of the lure that you're using. So what I've done is I've laid out a few different types of lures. We've got a mixture of shads, curltails, creature baits. I've also put a couple of crankbaits in there as well. All lures with completely different profiles to each other, and I'm going to talk you through each one and where it would kind of be suited and what it would be suited for. If I start by talking about rivers, so on the river that we're fishing today, it's quite a varied piece of water, so there are areas where it's quite uniform in depth. There are really interesting features such as overhanging trees and bushes as well, that are places where fish are likely to hide. And for targeting places where there's cover like that, I prefer to use a soft bait that's going to fall very slowly through the water column, something that's going to give the fish a good chance to see the lure as it's falling through. So one of my first choices would be a curltail, something like the Pro Grub. Because of the big curltail at the back, that slows the rate that the soft bait falls through the water at, and when rigged on the correct weight of jig head, it will fall through really nicely and give the fish plenty of time to see the lure. Another good option for casting to structures such as overhanging bushes, moored barges as well, that kind of thing, would be a creature bait. So again, with the extra appendages, it's going to slow the fall rate and give the fish more time to see the lure. There are certain shads as well that have got big paddle tails that will sink pretty slowly as well, something like a Zander Pro shad. But if I pick up a slick shad as an example, you'll see that it has a much more streamlined body and a very small paddle tail. So when you cast into structure, this is going to sink a lot faster than something like a Pro Grub or a critter, and it's not going to give the fish as much time to see that soft bait. So the kind of situation where I might use something streamlined like a slick shad is a venue where there aren't so many obvious structures like overhanging bushes, bridges, barges, that kind of thing, because this is going to sink to the bottom much quicker. I can also swim this on a straight retrieve as well, and it's also a little bit more subtle. Often places where you find bait fish as well, this would be a good choice. Another really important thing to bear in mind when choosing the profile of the soft bait is the colour of the water that you're fishing in. So for fishing rivers, canals that are very murky, I would choose something with a bigger profile and something that's going to cause a bit more vibration and movement, something that the fish are going to be able to home in on a little bit more easily. So something like a Pro Grub, a Zander Pro shad, with a deeper body and wide paddle tails or appendages are going to create a lot of movement and stand out really well in coloured water. Whereas if I pick up, say, a slick shad and a critter, these have got much more streamlined profiles, and although something like a critter will create quite a lot of movement, they're not going to stand out quite as much in the coloured water. Whereas on this river that we're fishing today, which is very clear, these are the two lures I've probably been using the most, along with crankbaits as well. So that's another very important thing to consider. Choosing the profile of a lure can also be dependent on what the fish are actually feeding on. So for example, if you're seeing bait fish splashing in the margins and you know there were fish sort of crashing into them and feeding on those, then you'd want to be using something like a shad or a suspending crankbait, something that's going to perfectly imitate something like a stunned roach or bleak. If you're fishing on a venue where there are signal crayfish present, then creature baits can be a great option. So this river that I'm fishing today has got a huge head of signal crayfish, and I've been using a critter for quite a large chunk of the day actually. It's one of those lures that perfectly imitates a signal crayfish, and it can work well for pike, perch and chub. Choosing the profile of a lure doesn't just apply to soft baits, it also applies to hard baits as well. And I've pulled out a couple of examples here from the Salmo range. This one here is the hornet and the bottom one is the minnow, and you'll notice that they have two completely different profiles. The hornet's got a much deeper, more rounded profile, and the minnow's much more streamlined, just like a minnow. The hornet is going to displace a lot more water, and it's got a much bigger profile which will show up better when you're fishing on venues that are murky or stained. Whereas the minnow, because it's got that much more streamlined profile to it, it makes it a little bit more subtle, and it's not going to create the amount of movement and vibration that something like a hornet might. So two different profiles to think about there when you're using crankbaits and other hard-bodied lures as well. It's not been the easiest of days fishing, but by being open-minded and keeping my options open, I've been able to put a few fish on the bank. So thanks for watching today's video. I hope you enjoyed it and learned something new. And for regular updates from me and the rest of the Foxrage team, please subscribe to the Foxrage YouTube channel, and tight lines when you're out on the bank next.